You're listening to the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and it's time for this week's Long Island News, the show that talks to newsmakers and other important people from Nassau and Suffolk County that matter to Long Island and Long Islanders like you. So each week we'll have a conversation about issues that affect all of us. I live on Long Island just like you, and I want to know more about the people making the big decisions that affect all of us. Well, this week we're going to talk with one of the declared candidates running for the open United States Senate seat here in New York, currently held by Kirstin Gillibrand. And today I'd like to introduce you to Diane Sare, a candidate running on the LaRoche Party ticket. Ms. Sare, welcome to this week's Long Island News.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So briefly, for those that may not know much about you, you live in Rockland County, but now, and you aren't originally from New York, right?
I'm not. I actually was born in Vermont, grew up in Maine, lived in D.C. for 10 years, lived in Jersey for 20 years. I went to school at Hamilton College for a year, and then transferred to New England Conservatory, and I've lived in New York about 5 years now. But did a lot of work in New York over the last decade or so.
So you're familiar.
Yes.
And okay, now, anything else that people need to know about you or that you'd like to tell them?
Well, other than being merely a declared candidate, I am on the ballot in New York, which is no small feat for an independent candidate, because in the 2019-2020 budget, they tripled the signature requirement. So I successfully got over 45,000. In this case, we turned in nearly 70,000 signatures. And I think I'm the only person to have done that with volunteers. That is not with paid petitioners.
Now, this isn't your first shot at politics either. You ran for Schumer's Senate seat and other seats as well in primaries and general elections, right?
I ran in 2022 against Schumer, and that was the first time that they had this outrageous new requirement. So I was the only and first person to qualify for statewide ballot access as an independent in 2022.
That must have been a tough thing to get through.
It was. Several people on my own team said, well, don't you have to set a point of when you're going to call it quits when you realize you really can't do this? And I said, no, we are going to do this. The world is in a lot of danger. We don't have good leadership. We have to succeed. And we did. It was very difficult. And as many people may not be aware, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Independence Party, the Serve America Party, all lost their ballot status because of this. The Libertarians and Greens had just gotten ballot status, which meant they would not have to petition, because their candidates for governor in 2018, Larry Sharpe and Howie Hawkins, had gotten over the threshold of votes to allow them to have a party line, which makes things much easier. You don't have to spend all that money. I mean, I didn't pay people to petition, but I spent about $80,000 just getting on the ballot. Airbnbs, gasoline in the cars, travel meals, printing, you name it, and then they changed the law, and then all these people had to get on and they couldn't. And my advantage, frankly, was my association with Lyndon LaRoche over 30 years. He had a major national organization, which people don't realize because it was so horrifically villainized and slandered, and he spent 5 years in federal prison. It was very much a precursor to what is happening around former President Donald Trump right now. Is, 95 indictments that everyone knows that wouldn't be happening if he weren't running for president.
Well, it also wouldn't be happening if he didn't commit the crimes. But if he did, there should be 95 indictments.
Oh, right. But then let's look at Menendez.
We used to say no one is above the law, and now sometimes we have to say some are above the law. Especially with the immunity issue being bandied about. Now, with all of the focus on the presidential election.
On that, let me just say, because I think, it's very nasty because the assault on this whole 91 indictments is so over the top, it causes people to think that therefore everything he does is right, or that they're afraid of him. And they lose their critical judgment because they get so angry about the injustice of the what is perceived correctly as a political witch hunt. I mean, the Democratic Party admitted that there was no evidence that Russia hacked the DNC server.
No, but
Hillary Clinton was trying to steal the election from Bernie Sanders, So, but that doesn't then mean that everything the candidate says is accurate. I am not endorsing a presidential candidate. I think we have to have a fair election process where you have debates on the merit of policy. Mm-hmm. Why don't we talk about policy? Why are we talking about?
Because it's a popularity contest. It's not about politics. Sadly, yeah.
Yeah, and
I would guess
stupid.
The things that you've gone through, you would be for publicly funded elections.
Yeah, I think that would help level the playing field. And actually, I think instead of donation limits where there's a gigantic loophole, because the candidate is allowed, there's a $3,300 limit. That's what I'm subject to because I don't have a super PAC or a PAC or any PAC funding my campaign. So no one can give over $3,300 no matter how wealthy they are. That's it, which obviously puts me at a disadvantage relative to Gillibrand or other people. Yep. The candidate is allowed to spend unlimited amounts of their own money. So it's really helpful if you're a multimillionaire. In other words,
even if I give you money personally, I would go right around that law if you then wanted to spend it on your campaign. So I could write you a check for $1 million and give it to you, Diane, right? And then you could spend it on your own campaign, which is
yes. Although they make me file a report with the ethics committee, which I also find hilarious because there's so much unethical behavior in our Senate. So I have to file a report saying, what do I have in my bank account, blah, blah, blah. And this is all public record. People can go and look and you'll discover we're not rich people in my household. So I don't have millions of dollars to throw in. Now, I heard someone saying that Trump waited a long time to announce in 2016 or 2015 because he was waiting to pull in a whole lot of money that wouldn't be noticed by the Federal Election Commission, in other words. No. But right. So you see from the get-go, our so-called elected government is an aristocracy. It's created that way, which is really terrible because the founding fathers intended that the average farmer should be in the government for a few years.
Well, that's exactly the idea. John Adams went to Congress and then he went home and went back to his farm. I don't think many of the Congress people and senators in government today have a place to go back to. This is their place. They live here, right. I agree with you. That shouldn't be. We don't get the best talent by letting it, turn sour in one place. You got to refresh the tree, right? Right. I agree with you 100% there. But I do think that the publicly funded elections would be a wonderful thing. I mean, you think our founding fathers even could fathom what $1 billion is? Because that's what I've heard it takes to be able to even run for president. Sure.
No, I don't think so. I mean, we didn't have television. We didn't have social media. We didn't have cell phones. So I don't think they probably
$1 billion. Imagine $1 billion. I don't even know if they ever even conceived of that number. Right?
Although I have to say, in those days, there were all kinds of dirty tricks that went on too, but maybe
that's
not.
That's true too. Yes.
Not on the scale that we're seeing.
But I mean, you remember. I mean, I remember growing up to say somebody was a millionaire. That was like, ooh, and then somewhere along the course of somebody said billionaire. And you go, and now I'm hearing numbers like trillion. It's just wild. It really is to think. And what a waste of money. If the public could fund all of those elections, the amount of money that we could save would be incredible. It seems like such a throwaway.
And that gets at also this massive disparity, which is just huge. I went to Rome, New York yesterday, which was hit by this tornado. And the place is level, and it is horrible. That several churches built in the 1800s missing their steeples now, the roofs ripped off. And I met actually a very compassionate electrical worker who had come in there from Rochester, and I asked him, what are you seeing here? Is this, he said, this is much worse than almost anything I've seen. The severity of this tornado was really powerful. And he said the street that it hit, because tornadoes, unlike hurricanes, they're very specific in their path, was not people who owned their homes. It was all apartment dwellers. It was all poor people who don't own anything, who probably don't have homeowners insurance. And an event like this can upend your entire life. You may find yourself in a shelter for 2 years after this. What are we doing about that? So for someone here, $50 or $100 is enormously important. And then you have people on the other end with billions and trillions. And, it's really surreal in a sense.
It is. You're listening to this week's Long Island News on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and today we're talking to Diane Sare, a declared candidate in the November election for the U.S. Senate seat on the LaRoche Party ticket. And the available seat, by the way, is currently held by Kirstin Gillibrand, who's also running for re-election. Now, we all know, we all constantly hear about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Can you explain to us what the LaRoche Party is all about, the founder, and you could tell us a little bit about where all that comes from?
Sure, I'd be glad to. First of all, it's not really a party. I named it that because the state of New York is so absurd that I'm an unaffiliated voter. You're not allowed to even use the word independent on the ballot. They just passed a law that you cannot use the word independent, New York, Empire, American. It's crazy. So they say you have to form an independent body. So I said, well, LaRoche is very well known. I worked with him for 35 years, for better or for worse. He was really a genius, American system economist. I'll take that name. We had about 80,000 subscribers to LaRoche's emails and publications in the state of New York. That's who I am. So I chose that name, and it is because what I represent are the policies which he fought for starting in the 70s, when he was trying to organize an international development bank. That he was the Quaker, as I am or was raised, and he, after Pearl Harbor, enlisted in the army as a medic. And he was stationed in Burma, and then he was stationed in India. And he said the people in India kept coming up to the Americans and saying, can you do something about our circumstances? You see here, we're enslaved. We're just producing raw materials. The finished goods are being manufactured somewhere else. And I think that really fueled his desire to level the field, which was really what FDR intended at the end of World War II. He intended that every single colony should have its independence. And he had rip-roaring fights with Winston Churchill about this, who said that would be the end of the British Empire, which, of course, was the point. So this, LaRoche met with Indira Gandhi before she was Prime Minister of India and then assassinated. She was the head of the non-aligned movement, right, which was a bloc of nations that he was organizing to drop what he called the debt bomb. And what the debt bomb is that instead of each nation standing up individually in an isolated way against the IMF and World Bank, you get a whole block of nations to declare a debt moratorium, and you bring down the system. You put an end to that evil, usurious system. And he met with the president of Mexico, López Portillo, in 1982, and he was really a millimeter from getting it. And Henry Kissinger wrote a letter to the FBI, which we got through Freedom of Information. And Kissinger said, can you do something about these LaRoche people? They're getting obnoxious. And by 1986, LaRoche also was working on fusion energy, which we really should have had by now had we not cut the funding. And that would be phenomenal. There's no radioactive waste. It uses a tiny amount of fuel for massive amounts of energy. Cheap, abundant energy. You could be developing the world. And he ended up running into Edward Teller from Lawrence Livermore Labs, who was working on lasers. So LaRoche and Teller came up with this idea of laser defense against nuclear missiles. So instead of Kissinger's mutual and assured destructions. Whoever can
Right.
blow up the world more times.
Right.
What a crazy
Yeah,
system.
it was always like, why don't we just wire the planet and give everybody a button? And when you get mad enough, you press the button, and then we're all,
Yeah, it's a really good way of saying it. So Reagan and LaRoche met at a debate. LaRoche was running as an independent briefly in 1980. He usually ran as a Democrat, but he was as an independent after he didn't get the nomination. Met Reagan. Reagan was talking about nuclear war, and LaRoche said, look, I have this idea because it would be a science driver. We don't have the technology yet. It would function like the moonshot. And the US and the Soviet Union develop it simultaneously, and you create the basis to get rid of our nuclear weapons. And Reagan loved it, and LaRoche ended up being Reagan's back channel to the Soviet Union. He was meeting with the Soviet ambassador to Washington and other people, and the Soviets rejected it. By 1986, LaRoche's home was raided. 400 FBI agents, US Marshals. We found out through Freedom of Information that the intent was to assassinate him. The deputy sheriff said he couldn't wait to pump him full of bullets.
Wow.
Yeah, and then they used everything they seized on the raid to target political supporters who may have had a criminal record or something to force them, to pressure them to say that LaRoche had stolen money or not repay loans. It was so ugly. And they finally convicted him of conspiracy to confuse the Internal Revenue Service.
To confuse?
Yeah, confuse and obstruct. It was so outrageous.
That sounds as ironic as it gets.
I know. It was in Alexandria, Virginia. The foreman of the jury was with FEMA. We used up all our strikes, and it was still full of FBI agents. I mean, who lives in Alexandria, Virginia, for God's sakes? There was no way you could get all the alphabet soup off the jury. So they convicted LaRoche, gave him a 15-year jail sentence, and Kissinger was there all the way. He was writing to the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board saying, you got to keep LaRoche in jail the whole time. You can't let him out. He got out under Bill Clinton. And that's a whole other story. But he served 5 years. A dozen of my associates, because I actually got really interested in working with LaRoche when I saw he was going to go to jail, because somehow my Quaker upbringing, I just thought, if you're fighting injustice, you're probably going to get in trouble. So when I saw this, I said, yeah, you know what? I'm going to work with these people. So that's why the LaRoche. And it's also my answer when people say, well, how do we know if we put you in Washington, you're not going to sell out like everybody else?
No, well, how do you know that with anybody?
Right. But I could have sold out long ago. I could have fled when the government was targeting my association. A lot of people did. I don't blame them. It's scary. But sometimes you place your identity in a bigger place, which is the good of humanity.
Yeah. It, too, has its people that do that pay for it. Right? Yeah. Which is why I guess we applaud them, because they do sacrifice. They don't just get to do their thing and then go back to their normal life. Life will never be the same after that.
Right.
So one of the biggest stories is not just politics, but the world now, the assassination attempt. I understand you have thoughts on this.
I actually put out a newspaper, and there was an article in my July 4th issue quoting from a statement I made on July 1st, warning that I thought there was a threat against Trump. And the reason I thought that is because the Prime Minister of Slovakia nearly was assassinated. He is a big opponent of escalating the war between Ukraine and Russia. He's one of the dissident voices in NATO, as is the Prime Minister of Hungary. And the way they described him in the press as a populist, this and that, it just somehow clicked. And I thought, this is the same way they talk about Trump. And it creates the conditions where you can set up the so-called lone assassin. Oh, he's so divisive. He's creating, so it's just some crazy guy. And that Trump keeps saying that he would end that war. And just to be very clear, I have severe differences with Trump on Israel, Gaza, but
that's my next question.
Yeah, but he does he has said publicly that it was NATO expansion, that this was the issue. And there are lists put out by the Ukrainians, really hit list, kill list. There's a new one called Texty, on which you have Trump, Kennedy Jr., I'm on it, 112 congressmen are on it, Tulsi Gabbard is on it. Anyone who's objected to this policy, who has any clout or say or pull or following, is on this list. So I said, I think that he's in danger. I think all of our presidential candidates are in danger. I think we're in a transition period. So for those billionaires who would like the world to go a particular way, if you can destabilize the United States, then...
Yeah, but these are. It's funny, though, that the people you bring up, Trump is kind of close to. He likes Viktor Orban. He likes that he gets to say and then they do what he says.
Well, Viktor Orban, I think, is heroically what he just did by meeting with Zelensky, Putin, Xi Jinping, and then did he also meet with Modi? I forget. But he then met with Trump because remember, Biden was vice president when the Obama administration overthrew the government of Ukraine and put in a bunch of hardcore right-wing,
I don't remember that at all.
2014, I do. I was really following very closely. I mean, they burned down the parliament. They were throwing Molotov cocktails and beating up parliamentarians with baseball bats.
Who's they? Who's they?
The people who took over the coup. And we called it a peaceful revolution. It was totally violent. And the people who came in...
But the Ukraine had a democratic government.
Not after that.
They still... Well, they did when the war started, right?
No. I mean, well, yes. And here's the funny thing.
I'm confused. You're confusing me very much.
Zelensky got elected because people thought he would uphold the Minsk agreements. What happened when the Obama administration and others overthrew the government of Ukraine and brought in neo-Nazis, which they were. They loved Stepan Bandera, the collaborator of Hitler who killed hundreds of thousands of Jews and Russians. They made his birthday a national holiday.
And this is what the democracy grew out of?
Yeah, the democracy. And they banned the Russian language in Ukraine, and they shut down all the Russian-speaking television stations. And then there was a famous massacre in Odessa where people were protesting the new regime, and this group, the Azov Battalion, which is the famous ones with the swastikas and everything, herded a bunch of people into a labor union building and set it on fire and burned them to death. So
I got to look this stuff up. This is interesting.
Well, this was known, and the U.S. Congress in 2018, led by people in New York, passed a resolution saying the Azov Battalion is neo-Nazi and we should not send them any weapons. 40 members of the U.S. Congress said this.
Were they wrong?
They were Democrats largely.
Were they wrong is my question.
Were they wrong? No, they were correct. They were correct. So what happened is the more Russian-oriented oblasts of Ukraine regions declared their independence. That was Donetsk and Lugansk. And they said, we want to speak Russian. We reject this crackdown. And the Kiev regime with the Azov and other people in it began shelling. And what Americans are never told is 14,000 people had been killed in this region since 2014. Mm-hmm. So Zelensky, and that's what the so-called Minsk, you've heard of the Minsk Accords? Mm-hmm. The Minsk Accord was a process whereby they were trying to get a ceasefire, basically say, you stop shelling those people in the region, let them speak Russian, they'll remain as part of Ukraine, but they're going to have special status, maybe like Taiwan and China. They're going to have special status within Ukraine. And Putin was working for that in good faith. And the next thing,
I don't know. Look, traditionally, the Ukraine has been the breadbasket of Russia. They fed most of Russia. And when they wanted their independence, Russia has been working since that happened to get them back by hook or by crook.
That's look, I'm telling you, you got to look up this history and you got to look up these.
And where can I look up that version? I've never heard that version. So,
well, You remember what happened in the Canadian Parliament where they saluted the SS guy?
No.
Okay, well, you can look up Stepan Bandera and his role in World War II, and you will find that since 2014, his birthday has now been a holiday. I mean, he was now it's eluding me, the famous massacre where they killed like 30,000 Jews in Ukraine. And the new regime just renamed the street after Bandera. It was called Kiev Way or something else. I mean, they really are glorifying this white supremacist nationalism.
If that was the case, there wouldn't be a war there, would there?
Yeah,
I mean, if they were all on the same page, you're making it sound like they're all on the same page anyway.
No, because NATO was backing and funding this because they wanted to weaken Russia. Now, my point about Zelensky is he got elected overwhelmingly 70% because he was Jewish and Russian speaking, and the Ukrainian people wanted peace. Like any extremist group, most people were not pro-Nazi. But when you have an element like that, they get so much terror that they end up becoming the dominant force because they're so terrifying. So people overwhelmingly voted for Zelensky because he said, I'm going to enforce the Minsk Accords. I'm going to get a ceasefire. I'm going to get the Azov battalion to stop shelling and killing these people. And he went to Mariupol, where the Azov battalion was based, and told them to stop it. And 10,000 people came out in the streets of Kiev demanding Zelensky's overthrow. And then one of his own ministers was assaulted at a public conference where he was arguing for people to have the right to also speak Russian. And they jumped up and threw him physically on the floor. And so Zelensky, he had no ability to do this. He was captured by this extremist element, if you will. And that was for a geopolitical design for us to have this insane collision with Russia where we violated James Baker III told Gorbachev when Germany was reunified, NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. NATO moved 1,000 kilometers to the east. We violated everything. And in 2021, when Putin said you can't put nuclear weapons in Ukraine, we basically gave him the middle finger and said, we're not going to sign a treaty. We're not going to agree. Now, do we think Kennedy was insane for not wanting nuclear missiles in Cuba? So please do the research. We've got enormous...
I can't. I'm almost salivating thinking of reading this. I've never heard a lot of this. But in any event, I think we
have very little time left because
yeah, we're kind of burning daylight. But anyway, my guest today has been Diane Sare, is now a declared candidate and on the ballot for the U.S. Senate seat, LaRoche Party ticket. We do again. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us, and keep in touch.
Thanks very much.
But the clock on the wall says it's time for this week's Long Island News to get on out of here. I'm Bill McIntyre. Remember, you can listen to us by searching for this week's Long Island News wherever you listen to podcasts, and we're right here every Friday on the radio at 3 p.m. on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.